drugs is a transnational business, so you need a transnational strategy. So if you have two administrations that are like forcing their own narrative, really protective, both of them, really talking a lot about their own countries, and you don't see a joint strategy, that's really not helping, because the narcos are thinking transnational and they're working transnational.
The opinions of the guests and host are their own and do not represent the opinions of Ironclad, the Border Patrol, or the Department of Homeland Security.
We cut through the partisan talking points. We're not interested in perpetuating fear. We're interested in seeking truth, hearing what's really going on America's Borderland. Welcome to Borderland, an Ironclad original. I'm your host, Vince Vargas. In today's episode, we have a award-winning, Emmy-winning journalist, investigative journalist named Peniley Ramirez, and she graces us with her time and explaining to us a lot of the investigative journalism work she did and explaining some of the corruption that she was able to unfold in her investigations. It's an incredible conversation. I hope you guys enjoy it. Here it is. Well, ma'am, it is an honor to have you on here.
Thank you.
I was a little intimidated by reading your background. But you have a very extensive background in investigative journalism and the work that you've done in writing. And so, one, it is an honor to be able to interview someone of your status in the journalism space. But two, I'm really excited about talking, about this subject that is been in all the media all the time now with drugs and Mexico and everything else. And so the corruption, all these things. And so it's just exciting to talk to someone who's done a lot of work in the space. And so thank you for being here with us.
Thank you.
Would you mind giving a brief bio for those who are listening and watching of your history?
Yeah. So my name is Peniley Ramirez. I'm an investigative journalist. I started my career in local journalism in Mexico. I'm Cuban, but I have spent the last 20 years of my life between the US and Mexico. And I used to work as an investigative correspondent for Univision. I spent 7 years there. And for the last year, I have been first leading the investigative unit and now co-leading the company with Futuro Media, which is a nonprofit news organization based in New York. And we do mainly podcasts, documentary films, and investigative journalism, also limited series. So my work currently is divided between leading the company, but also leading the news and investigative side of the newsroom.
What got you into doing investigative journalism?
Well, I think investigative journalism is something that you do, not something that you are. It's something that you are, not something that you do. And in my case, I'm an investigative journalist. That's the way I think. That's the way I approach life. I remember when I started dating my husband, that we went on a weekend to Puerto Vallarta, Mexico. And as soon as we landed on the airport, I saw some airplanes there. And I started writing down the plates of the airplanes. And he was like, "Why are you doing that?" And I said, "Oh, because I have been doing an investigation about how the cartels have been using American airplanes to drug dealing." And there were several airplanes there with American plates. So I'm telling you this anecdote to see that even in a moment that I was like most focusing on becoming in love with my husband, it's just the way I think, the way I approach life. So all my life I have been doing investigative journalism. And I think now is more needed than ever because we have so much misinformation and disinformation going around. And we have so much information in general, people getting feeds of things through social media, through TikTok, through videos on YouTube, through mainstream media as well. And we are we as professional journalists are competing with so much content that is created around, and people are really needing to know what is true, what is something that is more deeply reported. And I'm proud to say that I think even in this moment of a lot of competition, for content, I think investigative journalism still has a unique place in the agenda, because the way that we approach things with more nuance, more complexity, more getting into the bottom of things, it's something that people need and people value.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely correct. I think because of social media, people have been receiving information, whether it's true or false, and taking it as it is truth for them, right? And the investigative journalism side is a more deeply orchestrated information machine that is usually based on facts that are pulled from documents, interviews, and whatnot. And so the investigative journalism side, to me, is probably the most truthful journalism. When I say that, journalists are supposed to be leaning in the fair and truth, right? But it's kind of swayed where not now journalism on the mainstream media has become swinging agendas and not totally rooted on facts. And so the investigative journalism side, I think, is more important because it's based on a lot of truth and documentation and facts. And so, yes, I agree. I think it's very powerful, and it's why I'm happy we have you here today.
Thank you.
So you took 8 years to research in 4 countries and with more than 17,000 documents to finalize and publish your book, The Millionaires' War. I can't really pronounce it in Spanish the way the title is supposed to be, and I apologize because I'll mess that up. But what inspired you to take such a deep dive on the war on drugs?
Well, I started investigating the case of the, dirty money on the war on drugs a little bit of by chance, because it's a funny story. I was based in Mexico City at the time, and I saw that this was a potential investigation around one particular person, Genero Garcia Luna, that was at the time the leader of a powerful cabinet position in Mexico. He was leading the security in Mexico. During that time, Mexico was receiving a lot of money and support from the United States via something that was called the Merida Initiative. That was an initiative that started under democratic governments, and basically it started sending billions of dollars to Mexico to help potentially preventing the drugs from coming from Mexico and South America to the United States, to feed the vast demand of drugs that we still have in the United States. So the U.S. was sending all this money, billions of dollars to Mexico. And one of the main people receiving that money was this person, Genero Garcia Luna. And I discovered at the end of the administration of Felipe Calderón in 2012, that he was planning to move to Miami. And I was like, curious, why you're moving to Miami if you are just such a prominent person in Mexico at that point? And I discovered that he was, for several years, while he was working for the government, he was also preparing his departure to the United States, and buying houses, buying apartments in Mexico, in Florida, South Florida, mainly Miami. And he was doing it with the help of a family of people who were having, at the same time, millions of dollars in contracts with the Mexican government. So he was like giving these people money to get equipment and to get software for, spending part of the money that the U.S. was sending to Mexico, and at the same time receiving big favors from them. Like, for example, I discovered that he moved to a $3 million house in Miami that was sponsored by this business people. And at the same time, then I started covering something that other journalists was also covering, that was that this guy was having kind of a dual life. but because he was working with the Mexican government and really close with the DEA. He was at some point the main and closer ally of the DEA in Mexico. But he was also taking bribes from the cartels, specifically the Sinaloa Cartel. So the reason why I have been naming my investigation the Millionaires of the World, the Millionaires of War, is because Mexico was declaring a war on drugs, but at the same time, the people in charge of that war were at the same time working for the cartels and working with the US government and working with the business people that were profiting from that war. So it's like we have been having, and we still have, a lot of losers of that war in both sides of the of the border. We still have like hundreds of thousands of people dying from overdoses today in the United States, and we have hundreds of thousands of people dying because of the violence in Mexico. So we have a lot of reporting about, and you have been reporting some of it yourself, about who are the losers, who are the people who are like forced to leave their houses in Latin America, forced to move throughout the border, even with all the dangers, or facing a lot of problems, a lot of trauma. But I thought, and I still think, that there was a lack of reporting about the winners. So who is profiting from this? Who was profiting back in the day, and who is profiting still today from legal corporations, like big corporations that are like, quote unquote, securing the border, or trying the drugs to prevent from coming to the US streets, to the more informal winners, who are, of course, the drug leaders, but also a lot of corrupt politicians and corrupt people that are taking bribes or are taking any advantage of this so-called war. So that was my approach.
No, it's good. It's good. I like it. But it's also like you say, like real estate agents. If they work with the cartel and they help them purchase, but then they receive monetary value from that, well, then they're part of the problem as well, or they're part of the winners who are quietly receiving funds throughout the process of helping.
Exactly. So it's like, who is really profiting from this? And if you see, even, there are legal people profiting from this. So if you go to, for example, if you check today about the deportation machine in the United States, you will see people benefiting from these deportation flights. And they're legal business people. It's not that they're doing anything illegal, but they're profiting from business, or they're profiting from detention centers, and they're profiting from all these programs around preventing the drugs from coming to the United States. But on the other side, you have still a multi-million business of drugs that we started with marijuana, then cocaine, and today is mostly fentanyl, that is highly profitable, reaching the streets of every single city in the United States, and making the cartels richer than ever.
Yeah, and you said corrections facilities. I was a corrections officer for a private prison at one point, receiving my $23 an hour, right, years ago, and now realize that I was part of the system that was receiving an income based on this whole immigration smuggling, this whole space of that, which is interesting when you look at it.
I remember a few years ago when I was still in Univision, I worked on a special documentary that we called Deportation Inc. And one of the angles of the story was the centers, like the one that you worked at, and how they were, they were charging the government per night, per person.
Yep.
Like it was like a 5-star hotel, the price, I can't remember at that for sure, but it was over $200 per person per day, or $300 per person per day, while the people working there were, like you said, making not a lot of money per hour.
Yeah.
So it is a highly profitable business. If you see that, in that case, it's a legal business, a perfectly legal business. But you have a lot of illegal business going on at the same time, with people profiting from, making the fentanyl or smuggling it through the border or transporting it or distributing it to the US cities, but also taking bribes for looking to the other side.
That's the interesting about the drug space. There's so much corruption, and I've interviewing enough people to know some of the police officers, the ones that are not receiving money, still have to look away at times, because they're still involved in some capacity. They might not have to take money, but they will look away, or else they risk their lives when not doing that. And so everyone is involved in this kind of conversation. So when you wrote the book, for those who are unfamiliar with Genero Garcia Luna, what is a big role that he played in the war on drugs? Like, what was his big thing?
Well, just for people in the US to understand, at some point he was called the Mexican Hoover by the US authorities. He was like the big man, the big name in Mexico that was like, playing as the guy who was connecting the US government, the money that was coming from the US, that was going from the US to Mexican institutions. And he was at the same time the person working like closely with the DEA agents that were like working in Mexico. He was also receiving a lot of information, like classified, important information from US agencies that were providing some information to Mexico with the purpose of Mexico acting, against the cartels. So he was receiving a lot of valuable information provided by the United States. He was at the same time the one that was leading a lot of the efforts to capture these leaders. And something that we have seen first in my reporting and the reporting of other colleagues, and last year and this year I have been covering a trial of Garcia Luna. We haven't talked about it, but after many years that he was spending a nice luxury life in Miami after he left office in Mexico, he was detained. So he was arrested in 2019, not in Miami, but in Texas. And he was formally accused in New York by a grand jury of being sort of a dual agent, working at the same time for the government of Mexico and for the Sinaloa Cartel. So what we learned during that trial is that, Garcia Luna was meeting with people like really famous and important people in the United States, like Barack Obama, like Hillary Clinton, like a lot of high members of several, in that case, was Democratic administrations. And he was receiving money, receiving information, receiving awards from the United States as the best police of the year, etc. But I think the information that he was receiving was very important because he was profiting from there, and he was then passing that information to the cartels. So what is the kind of information that he was giving to the cartels according to what we learned during the trial? He was, for example, telling be careful, you're going to be detained, or the US is preparing this indictment against you, or I'm going to do this operation to detain you. So I'm telling you so you can run before the police comes, or the Navy or the soldiers. So he was sometimes he was like appointing the police chief in a city, and not just appointing any person, but appointing a person that was loyal to the cartel. Or, and this is one of the most extreme examples, he was providing uniforms and IDs of an organization that existed in Mexico back in the day, that it doesn't exist anymore. That was kind of the FBI in Mexico. And he was allowing the narcos to use like real uniforms, real IDs from that corporation, so that this narcos, mainly from the Sinaloa Cartel, could go into a rival's territory dressed as police officers with real IDs to confront them as if they were part of the government, but they were not part of the government. They were the rival organization. So imagine a guy who can do all of this while at the same time he's being photographed with the president of the United States, or at that time, the Secretary of State of the United States.
Is there any belief that some of the information he received from the U.S. government was to protect the Sinaloa Cartel?
was used to protect the Sinaloa Cartel for sure. Yeah, we don't think, I have no proof that the US knew that he was corrupted or when he was corrupted. So something that I have investigated and something it was told during the trial as well, is that at some point the US, not just with him, but in general, US agencies have this technique of planting some information to really make sure if that person is loyal or if they can trust a person or a person that they're collaborating with. And this is not just happening with Mexico. It has happened with people that collaborate in Mexico or in Central America or in Colombia or even in the Middle East. So this is a technique that the US agencies typically use to plant some information and to see if this person is loyal. We think that some of that happened, but I have no proof if he was indeed only playing with the Sinaloa Cartel or also taking money from other organizations. The one that is confirmed because he was convicted for it was the Sinaloa Cartel. But at some point he was working with several folks from several organizations.
Crazy. Could you explain how the idea of the war on drugs initially focused on domestic issues, but eventually involved millions in U.S. tax dollars?
Yes. So when the war on drugs was declared in Mexico, 2006, it was mainly to contain, an escalated violence that Mexico was experiencing at the time. So it is true that Mexico was seeing, more crime, more murders in general. But the issue that it was declared as a war, which is an informal war, because to have a proper war, you need another part. So you're war against something, but in this case, you were war against, where you were declaring a war against something that didn't really exist as a thing. That was the narco world, because the narco world is not a thing, is a compound of several organizations, smaller and bigger organizations. And even within the organizations, like, for example, again, the Sinaloa Cartel, it's not a triangle of hierarchical power, and you have a boss that is a boss of another boss, and it's a boss of another boss. It's an organization of people who work together and try to benefit from selling the drugs, basically. And violence, it is a part of the organization to maintain control, but it's not the purpose of the organization. The purpose of the organization is to make profits from selling and distributing drugs. If they need to be violent to achieve that goal, of course they will. But the violence itself is not the goal. So when Mexico declared the war on drugs, the first thing they did was to send some troops, some soldiers, to some specific parts of the country where things were getting dangerous, and the population living there was in fear, etc. All that is true. And then at some point, the US started providing more help and more money. And that's why they signed this agreement called the Merida Initiative, and they started sending billions of dollars to Mexico. And what was the initiative for? Mainly, they were commitments on both sides. The US was committing, for example, to lower the demand. That is something that we know that never happened and still is not happening today. No. Mexico was committing to lower corruption, which is something that we also know that never happened and didn't happen, and it's not happening right now. So both countries failed the purposes that they set for this. And now what they did recently in recent years is they didn't cancel the agreement. They just changed it to another type of agreement that still exists today. And what they have been doing is mostly like providing information, providing some training, at some point providing some equipment and providing some money. And
where do those billions go? Sorry.
That's a good question. I have been tracking that for many years. So some of the money, as I have been able to track it, went to this contracts, like government contracts, for things that were, for example, I'm gonna put a surveillance system in one of the cities with more, with a greater number of murders, like Ciudad Juarez. And they did have some results, but we don't know if all the money was really spent on the things that they need to do it, because at some point, also the cartels were profiting from this equipment that they were like sort of using information that was obtained by this. And all other part of the money was for uniforms or for, constitutional reforms, or for sending some people to be trained in the United States. So a lot of the money end up trying to build a new system, a judicial system and justice system, but it's obviously not working if you see the numbers, again, on both sides of the border, because we'll still have hundreds of thousands of people dying in Mexico every year. And the same with people dying in the United States because of the overdoses.
What's going on, everybody? I want to let you know about an ongoing effort in Western North Carolina to help victims of Hurricane Helene, and how you can help our friends at the Sentinel Foundation. The hurricane has displaced people around the region and destroyed countless homes. However, Sentinel is on the ground helping. They've been actively getting critical supplies to residents in some of the area's most isolated locations. They've been able to provide over 60 Starlink systems to fire departments, police departments, and churches so that they can communicate and coordinate for their communities. They've also organized both aircraft and ground units to transport and deliver donations. So far, they've accepted and organized an estimated 7 million pounds of materials and distributed about 4 million pounds to support the ongoing relief efforts. Sentinel has also continued to monitor reports of child trafficking, exploitation within the area of operation through law enforcement. To find out more about their efforts to help hurricane victims and their anti-child exploitation efforts, and to see how you can help, please check out foundationsentinel.org.
This is a kind of an off question. Just curious. Do you know if some of that funding is what trained Los Zetas?
Yes, part of the money was at the end not directly used, but it was used to train some members of the military. And those some members of the military then quit the military, and they end up being part not just of Los Zetas, but the cartels.
Yeah.
So there is a recent study that came out last year that I think tells a lot about this. So if you see in Mexico, one of the top employers is the drug cartels. So the drug cartels is one of the places where you have more people directly or indirectly working for them, because they are working directly as killers, or as people transporting drugs, or as people making the drugs, or as people caring for some fields, up in the mountain, for different things. But you have a whole indirect economy related to the drug cartels as well. So if you go to some cities like Mazatlan in Sinaloa, or Culiacan, or some cities in Tamaulipas, you will see that a lot of legal business that are in there that maybe are for, to sell ice cream, or is a restaurant, or something that is officially unrelated to the drug world. But the money that was used to open that business was dirty money from the drugs. So you have a complicated situation, because you have entire economies, or economies in some cities, that are like partly dependable of this dirty money. And even if you have pretty decent people making a pretty decent life, getting their salaries to work in a restaurant, and they don't have idea that they're also part of the laundry machine, because the money that was put into opening that business is money from the drug-related business. So right now, if you see, it's really hard to differentiate in Mexico what money is legal money, and what money comes indirectly from this business. And this is, of course, easier to see in some cities, some states.
Yeah, I was filming a TV show in Tecate, and we stayed in a really nice hotel, and I was like, this is really nice. And there was an assumption that it was built off of cartel money, and someone said that to me, and I said I wouldn't doubt that there might be some truth to that. Because some businesses, right, I know that, you know, some of the cartels have been using their money to buy legitimate businesses, just like you were saying.
Exactly. And for example, someone working on the lobby of that, that hotel, or someone cleaning in that hotel, it's a decent person, like making a life with a salary. And that person might have no idea that the money is really coming originally from the drug cartels. And that's why it's so hard to trace. I acknowledge that it's hard for the authorities of, both countries to trace this money. But it's also true, and I think my investigation proves it, that there is way more accountability to be held. Because the US, for example, went, they detained Genero Garcia Luna. He went on trial in New York. He's not convicted. And he was sentenced a few weeks ago to 38 years in prison.
Yep,
All of this is going to happen. But at the same time, we don't have a single person from the United States responsible of providing all this money and all this information and all this trust to this man for more than a decade that he was, the strong man of the security in Mexico, while the US was, keeping him powerful and giving him awards and giving him money and giving him information.
So there's no proof that anyone knew he was corrupt.
Well, what it's true is that I have been digging enough to know that there was more information about him than the one that we saw in the trial. So we know, because I have been interviewing, members of the Secretary of State and former members of the DEA, and I was told by them there are more records than the records that were legally able to present during the trial by the prosecutors. So we know, and I have been reporting on this, that there were some tapes of him being corrupt. There was some information that the US knew but didn't consider it confirmed. And it was some information that was held by the DEA, and the US ambassador to Mexico was never informed. So how much of that is intentionality, or how much of that is that some of the material that they have was not, let's say, legally obtained or usable for a prosecutor's office? Or also, how much is that he was useful? He was very useful for a long time. And this is important because it's not just the case of Genero Garcia Luna. He's a case study for something that is being happening around. We just had recently also in New York the conviction of Juan Orlando Hernandez, which is the former president of Honduras. And Juan Orlando Hernandez, well, some people within the US government were thinking that he was corrupt, his brother was corrupt, they were getting money from the cartels, again, the Sinaloa Cartel. He was in Washington being photographed with Donald Trump when he was president. And people were saying, oh, he is a strong man and he's our ally in Honduras. So it's not about one administration or one party leading the US. It's more about the way that these security agencies work in the United States, and how sometimes they withheld information from one agency to the other agency, or they withheld information from the US ambassador to any country where they are. During the trial of Garcia Luna, we had a testimony of the US ambassador, and he was pretty much convinced, saying, I didn't know anything. And then I interviewed someone from his team, and he said he didn't know anything indeed, because the DEA knew, but the DEA didn't tell the ambassador. So it's like a crazy movie, right? Like that you have a US ambassador in a Latin American country clueless about someone that he's meeting, and the DEA has the information about this person, and the DEA is not telling the ambassador. It looks like a movie, but it's reality.
Yeah, I'm watching a TV show on Netflix right now called The Ambassador, and it's reminding me of all of this. You've said that the war on drugs was a complete failure. What are your thoughts on the opposite approach taken by AMLO, and what are some alternative strategies that that the U.S. should use in Latin American countries to consider reducing the harm and the cause of drugs?
Well, with AMLO and now with the current Mexican president, Claudia Sheinbaum.
Shoe bomb, right?
Yeah, Claudia Sheinbaum. I think there is a change in the public agenda, the public speech, but I don't see that much of difference in reality. So what they have been saying is, oh, this is not a war anymore. And they have the López Obrador administration had this catchy phrase saying in Spanish, abrazos, no balazos. So they were saying,
hugs, not bullets.
Hugs, not bullets. But if you see the numbers, the López Obrador administration end up with the highest number of people killed in the recent history of Mexico. So it's not true that this public agenda of let's be more comprehensive or let's go to the roots, causing roots, it's going to make a huge difference. What they still were militarizing the country more than ever before. They were still having like a large majority of the soldiers of the country out on the streets. They were still devoting a lot of money for weapons, a lot of money for putting soldiers out there in every single town. And we still have hundreds of thousands of dollars that are laundered every day. We saw the fentanyl rising as the mega business, and we have seen the increasing numbers of victims of overdoses in the United States. So it's important to be careful that one thing is what the politicians say, and another thing is what they do. Because if you see, I just wrote a recent article about the quote unquote new strategy from the new Mexican president, Claudia Sheinbaum. She just took office on October 1st. And a few days after she took office, she did a daily conference in the morning. And she said, oh, this is my new strategy. So I had some fun analyzing the strategy and comparing the strategy to the strategy that was presented in 2006 with when the war on drugs was declared. And I found literally copy-paste phrases from one to the other one, like the using of the same exact terms, the using of the same exact approaches, saying that they're going to the roots, they're going to attack the causes, they are going to provide money to people living in poverty so they don't need to work for the narcos, they can work on other things. And they will create a strategy that has a lot of gathering intelligence, and they will go. So a lot of the things that they're saying now, like, oh, this is our unique, innovative approach, this is what we're going to be doing now, are things that we have been listening to since 2006. So I think, again, going to the beginning of this conversation, that's why investigative journalism matters, because you go beyond the headline and you go beyond what any politician is saying. And you say it's not about whose party is leading. It's about what are the things that they say. Because I think when you go bipartisan in the case of the United States, or you don't really have a political agenda to defend one party or the other party, if you're just focusing on what they're doing or what they're going to say they're doing, you can see the similarities. So whatever they say, the thing is that what are the approaches that they're taking and what are the results that they are having? And so far, even with Democrats or Republicans in the United States, and here, even with the right or the left, they have really similar approaches and they have really similar bad results. So I think it's more important to do the analysis in that way, more than to say, is this administration under this administration.
I like that.
We don't just do the filmmaking. We do everything. We've taken a case study of over 30 projects that we've done over the past 15 years, and we put together what we believe is the most effective and efficient content funnel for brands. They need content on a daily basis. They need to be talking to authentic end users. We want your team to bring its most challenging problems and allow us and our team to apply our proven methods to your brand to take it to another level.
Based on your extensive work in investigating the war on drugs and Luna's story, what do you think would need to change on both Mexico and U.S. approach when the issue with drug trafficking and corruption law enforcement? Like, how can we fix it, in your opinion?
Well, that's $1 million question.
Yes.
I'm glad that I'm not a politician or a policymaker, and I don't really need to resolve what to be done. And then my work is more like investigating what they do and what is not working or what is working. But something I have seen, in my extensive working on the ground, is that the availability of weapons, it's something that is really damaging. We have seen that in the United States with, drug-related and non-drug-related crime, from mass shootings affecting kids in our elementary schools to how violent some U.S. cities are still today. And in the case of Mexico, 90% of the weapons that are used every day to kill people in Mexico are coming from the United States. So they are smuggled relatively easy through the border, and they are feeding a huge market. And again, talking about who are the winners, I would say if you're in the business of selling weapons and you have a war down your southern border, you're gonna sell a lot of weapons, and that's what's been happening. So Mexico both Mexico and the United States have been doing a poor job trying to control the flow of those weapons. And something else I have seen is they have been doing, both countries, a poor job really tracing the dirty money coming into formal economy, as we talk with your example of the hotel or my taqueria, or tracing the money that goes to pay politicians or pay bribes. Because if you don't trace that money, then the business keeps going. Something that I think the authorities have been doing for many years that is obviously not working is to go over after these big names. And every time they have like a big fish, they do a press conference and they're so happy and they congratulate themselves. But then what happens the next day? Every time that you catch a drug lord, and I'm not saying let them free, but every time you catch a drug lord, you should wonder what happens the next day. And the next day, what happens is you have a new leader. It's not that, oh my God, El Chapo was arrested, that's the end of the Sinaloa Cartel. Or El Mayo Zambada was arrested in July of this year. Oh my God, there is no more fentanyl coming from the Sinaloa Cartel to the United States. That's not true, because it's, again, such a profitable business that has so many people involved. So I think that the approach from authorities of going over after these big fishes and not really focusing on the operation, the money laundering, the weapon that are available for them, and also going after the clients, the ultimate clients in the United States, who is really distributing the drugs to the final customer. I think that approach more aggressively will have, and we have seen in those cases when they have been doing it, better and more results than going after the big names.
How about newly, President-elect Trump, and how do you think will his relationship with Claudia Sheinbaum would affect the war on drugs and potential traffic that's coming from the borders?
Well, we will see. Recently we learned that the Secretary of State of the United States will be Marco Rubio, who is another person that has been like pretty hard on the public speech around, the cartels and corruption in Mexico, etc. I think if we believe what they have said so far, it's going to be a pretty tense relationship. But it is true that Claudia Sheinbaum is a protege of López Obrador. And López Obrador's relationship with Trump was pretty good. They didn't have major problems. So we will see. It's a little too soon. But if you believe all the things that Trump said during the campaign, it's expected to be hard for Mexico, I would say.
Yeah, he they just newly appointed the border czar, Tom Homan. Tom Homan, who has a history with the director of ICE at one point, also former border agent. He's already publicly stated they're going to be very harsh punishments on illegal immigration, but also he made a comment towards the cartel. And so I'm interested in seeing what that looks like from where you're at. What does it feel knowing that President-elect Trump is going to be in office? Is there any kind of feeling that's happening, kind of a buzz? Is it a negative or a positive?
Well, I think if we believe what he has said during the campaign, the relations will be really tense. We should expect, of course, less money going to Mexico to help, a demand of Mexico. But on the other hand, I also see Mexico saying that the U.S. needs to be held accountable for the things that are the U.S. responsibility, like, for example, the flow of weapons or the demand of the drugs. So what is unfortunate about this is if we take into account what happened during the first Trump administration, we will see less cooperation and less flow of information. And even with the risk of having someone like Genero Garcia Luna that can, be using that information in a bad way, I think drugs is a transnational business. So you need a transnational strategy. So if you have two administrations that are like forcing their own narrative, really protective, both of them, really talking a lot about their own countries, and you don't see a joint strategy, that's really not helping, because the narcos are thinking transnational and they're working transnational. So I think hopefully, even in an administration that is so confrontational in the public agenda, as we have seen with the Trump administration, first during his first term and now during the campaign, at some point, they need to work together, because there is no way to achieve something important if they don't have some flow of information, for example. Because again, it's not that you have a Mexican narco that is just working in Mexico and everything happens in Mexico, because that Mexican narco doesn't care about political agenda. They have their client in Chicago and they're speaking all the time, and the client in Chicago needs the provider in Mexico. So they're still working together, even whoever wins the Mexican presidency or the U.S. presidency.
Oof. Well, ma'am, honestly, I don't want to take the rest of your time. I really appreciate it. I'm excited to dig into a lot more of your work. Again, it's an honor to have you here on some of your status as a journalist, and hopefully we can connect in the future more.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and thank you for keep talking about these issues, because our issues affecting like everyday people beyond politics.
Thank you for listening to Borderland, an Ironclad original. Don't forget to share and like all the social media things you need to do. But also, if you have any questions, or if you have someone in particular you'd like for me to interview, please put that in the comments. We'll try and cater to that as soon as possible. Let us know.